License and registration again?
I already handed them over.
Where are you headed?
To a pharmacy assignment in Dallas.
You expect me to believe that?
This is my state license.
That's not proof of anything.
You can verify
People
it.
show fake cards all the time.
It has my name and number.
Step back for a second.
You're not actually checking it, are you?
The stop takes place on a quiet stretch of highway in northern Texas. Cars pass intermittently, some slowing to glance at the interaction. The woman involved is a licensed pharmacist traveling between work locations, carrying all required documentation for her profession. The officer, conducting a routine traffic stop, applies standard questioning, but small assumptions about age, race, and occupation influence how the encounter unfolds. At this point, the officer has not threatened physical harm or raised his voice, but the dynamic is already uneven. The pharmacist remains calm and cooperative, presenting her credentials multiple times. The officer glances at the documents but continues to insist on additional verification. From an outside perspective, the procedure is ordinary, asking for identification, confirming travel reasons, and checking licenses. Yet the consistency with which her documentation is questioned introduces a subtle but significant tension. Evidence suggests this is part of a broader pattern. Certain professional travelers, especially women or minorities, may be subject to repeated scrutiny. This is not unique to this officer but reflects discretionary judgment in routine stops. The environment, the roadside, the passing cars, the muted hum of traffic, offers no dramatic context. The incident is contained, almost banal in appearance, but the misjudgment quietly escalates. The misunderstanding arises from two intersecting facts. The pharmacist's credentials are legitimate, but they do not match the officer's mental model of who fits that role. Assumptions guide the officer's questions more than procedure. Each verification step, though factual, reinforces the officer's initial doubts, creating a loop where calm clarification is met with additional requests. This phase establishes the factual groundwork. The officer believes there is reason to doubt, while the pharmacist complies fully with standard documentation requirements. There are no external influences other than the passing traffic and occasional glance from other drivers. The incident is ordinary in setting, but signals how small misperceptions can quietly magnify into procedural escalation. By the end of this section, the viewer understands what is happening, where it is happening, and why the interaction, though calm, is unlikely to conclude without further complication. The groundwork is set for the narrative to expand into the pharmacist's background, showing how her professional identity contrasts with the officer's assumptions. The woman involved is a licensed pharmacist based in Texas. She completed her pharmacy degree at a state university and earned her professional license shortly after graduation. Over the past decade, she has worked in multiple pharmacies, managing inventory, filling prescriptions, and overseeing compliance with state and federal regulations. Her colleagues describe her as meticulous and reliable, someone who follows procedures closely and rarely encounters issues with management or regulatory bodies. Her typical workday involves long hours and frequent travel between locations to consult with staff or deliver critical supplies. Documentation is central to her profession. Licenses, permits, and professional IDs are checked regularly, and she is accustomed to presenting them on request. On this day, she is traveling for routine business, carrying her credentials as she always does. Although she has maintained a spotless professional record, there was a prior moment where she was misjudged in a similar way. Several years earlier, during a regional inspection at one of her pharmacies, an official questioned her credentials despite their validity. The incident was resolved quickly once verification occurred, but it left her aware that professional authority can be questioned unexpectedly, even when fully legitimate. This previous experience is quiet, unremarkable to others, and left no lasting emotional mark, but it situates her awareness for the current encounter. Outside work, her life is structured and practical. She maintains a modest routine, commutes regularly, and has built a reputation for reliability among peers. She has no history of legal issues or public disputes and is known for her methodical approach to problem solving. Her professional competence and attention to detail make her confident in her ability to navigate situations that require documentation and verification. This background establishes the contrast between her professional credibility and the officer's assumptions during the traffic stop. She is experienced with protocol, accustomed to scrutiny, and prepared to demonstrate her legitimacy calmly and clearly. Yet, these qualities alone are insufficient to prevent misjudgment in the moment. The encounter occurs against a backdrop of competence and routine, showing how a misunderstanding can arise even for someone highly trained and professional. By presenting this restrained backstory, the viewer gains context. The woman is not reckless, confrontational, or dramatic. She is simply a professional navigating an ordinary day when unexpected assumptions and procedural doubt create an escalating situation. This framing allows the story to focus on events and systemic behavior rather than personal emotion or melodrama. The encounter continues step by step, unfolding in an ordinary roadside setting. The officer stands near the vehicle, clipboard in hand, while the pharmacist remains seated, calm, and cooperative. Cars pass intermittently, the hum of tires on asphalt mixing with distant engine noises. The officer requests documents again, and the pharmacist reaches into her bag to hand them over. The movement is casual, but the officer interprets it as hesitation. "You're taking your time with that," he says. "I'm just making sure you get everything," she replies. She hands over her license and professional ID, allowing him to examine both. He glances at the credentials but does not nod or acknowledge them. Instead, he repeats his questions about her travel purpose. She explains clearly that she is traveling to fulfill professional duties, visiting a pharmacy to oversee operations and deliver supplies. The officer asks for the state-issued license for verification. She presents it, along with her pharmacist card, pointing to the official registration number. He examines the documents but maintains a neutral expression, offering no comment. The environment remains quiet except for occasional traffic noise and a faint sound of a radio in the background. At one point, she reaches for her phone to provide a reference contact at the pharmacy. The gesture is misread. The officer interprets it as evasive behavior. "I don't want to see your phone yet," he says, leaning slightly back. She pauses, removing her hands from the device, and restates her willingness to provide information. A passing driver slows momentarily to look, then continues on. Another vehicle pulls into the roadside parking area, but the driver does not engage. The scene remains contained. No other civilians are involved yet, and the interaction is limited to two adults exchanging information. Small procedural steps become repetitive. The officer asks for identification again, citing a need to confirm details. She provides the same documents, pointing to the verification numbers. "They can check these immediately," she says, indicating the online registry. The officer acknowledges the comment but continues with standard questioning. The situation begins to feel slow and uncomfortable, not because of aggression, but due to repeated disbelief. Each verification she offers is met with neutral acknowledgement and another question. The pattern demonstrates how routine behavior, presenting credentials, explaining one's work, can be misinterpreted as unusual if the officer's assumptions do not align with reality. The pharmacist remains composed, answering calmly and efficiently. She does not raise her voice, gesture abruptly, or attempt to argue. The officer repeats questions and instructions, staying consistent with procedural expectations. The background hum of the highway continues, punctuated by the occasional sound of a passing truck. By the end of this section, the stage is set for escalation. The misunderstanding has become structured. Compliance from the pharmacist is met with repeated requests, small gestures are misread, and the normal rhythm of a professional roadside check has begun to stretch into a drawn-out process. The story remains grounded in ordinary events, showing how everyday assumptions can quietly create tension. The officer's tone remains measured, but his persistence increases. He repeats his request for documents, now asking for additional verification beyond the professional ID and license the pharmacist has already provided. She complies calmly each time, producing the same credentials and explaining clearly her work assignment. "You've shown me these already," she says. "I need to be sure. People sometimes falsify this," he replies. The background remains ordinary, passing cars, distant traffic sounds, and a faint hum from the officer's radio. One driver slows to glance at the stop and then drives away. Another vehicle, a small delivery truck, pauses briefly, and the driver observes the interaction silently before moving on. There are no crowds, no confrontation, no raised voices, only quiet repetition and skepticism. At one point, the pharmacist reaches to adjust her documents in the console, and the officer misreads it as evasiveness. "Do not reach for anything without telling me," he says, leaning slightly toward the vehicle. She pauses immediately, her hands on her lap, and repeats that all materials are visible and ready for inspection. The officer nods briefly but continues his questions. Small dismissals punctuate the encounter. When she points out a verification number that can be checked online, he glances but does not engage. He questions the origin of her travel, the scheduling of her assignments, and the legitimacy of her license, each time as if hearing it for the first time. There is one brief moment where she realizes that, no matter how compliant she is, the officer's assumptions are unlikely to shift. She notices her heartbeat quickens slightly but maintains composure. The scene is private and contained. No other witnesses intervene, though one bystander, a driver waiting to turn, glances briefly before continuing on. The pharmacist continues responding calmly, repeating her statements in full without raising her voice. The officer, in turn, repeats his questions, checking and rechecking, maintaining professional but rigid posture. By now, the dynamic has settled into a pattern. Each clarification she provides is met with mild disbelief, small but clear dismissals, and requests for repeated verification. She notices that the officer is not consulting any external resources to confirm her claims immediately, relying instead on his internal assumptions. The subtle humiliation arises from the quiet, repeated questioning rather than any overt accusation. Throughout, there is no shouting, no physical threat, and no dramatic gesture. The tension grows through repeated disbelief, misinterpretation of normal gestures, and the officer's unwillingness to accept the evidence at face value. The environment, ordinary traffic, passing vehicles, the hum of radios, amplifies the quiet nature of the escalation. By the end of this section, the situation has become an extended verification loop. The pharmacist's professionalism remains unquestionable, yet it is insufficient to convince the officer. The scene sets the stage for intervention by a higher authority, showing how repeated assumptions and procedural rigidity can escalate even in calm, controlled conditions. After several minutes, a supervisor arrives on the scene. The officer briefly steps aside, handing over the documents and explaining the situation in neutral terms. The supervisor begins a systematic review, checking the pharmacist's state license, employment verification, and professional registration numbers. Each piece of information confirms exactly what the pharmacist has stated. Her credentials are valid, her assignments are legitimate, and her professional identification is authentic. The supervisor speaks quietly but directly. Everything checks out. She's a licensed pharmacist in good standing. The officer glances at the documents again, hesitating. There is a subtle shift in posture. His confidence diminishes slightly, replaced by a hint of uncertainty. He looks at the supervisor, then back at the woman, clearly processing that the earlier assumptions were misplaced. The pharmacist remains calm, continuing to provide any additional clarification requested. She does not attempt to explain her frustration or defend herself beyond the factual information she presents. The supervisor confirms her employer and travel purpose over a phone call, quietly relaying the verification to the officer. At this point, the officer pauses, reviewing the details internally, his earlier insistence noticeably tempered. The shift is not dramatic but palpable. The supervisor does not scold or admonish. The confirmation of facts alone is enough to change the dynamic. The officer steps back from the car slightly, nodding in acknowledgement, and ceases repeating the verification requests. The quiet correction underscores how procedural oversight and factual confirmation can de-escalate situations without theatrics or public attention. No public acknowledgement or apology occurs at this moment. The officer remains silent. The supervisor efficiently concludes the review, and the pharmacist gathers her documents. The surrounding environment, the passing cars, intermittent radio chatter, and muted traffic noise, continues as before, unchanged. The incident has moved from prolonged skepticism to resolution through verification rather than confrontation. By the end of this section, the misunderstanding has been formally corrected. The officer has recognized the legitimacy of the pharmacist's credentials, and the supervisor ensures that all procedural records reflect the proper resolution. The pharmacist is now free to continue her travel with her professional identity fully confirmed. The interaction demonstrates the quiet but effective role of authority and factual verification in correcting procedural misjudgments. The stage is now set for the subsequent review, legal response, and organizational consequences, which will reveal how this incident extends beyond the immediate roadside interaction into systemic accountability and formal consequences. Following the traffic stop, the incident entered a formal review process within the department. Body camera footage was examined, showing the interaction from start to finish. Internal investigators noted that while the officer's behavior did not involve physical aggression, his repeated disbelief and disregard for verified credentials were procedural lapses. These actions triggered a review of departmental practices regarding verification of professional identification and interaction with travelers in similar contexts. The officer involved was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The leave was non-punitive at first, standard procedure during any internal review. Investigators interviewed both the pharmacist and the officer, reviewing statements, professional IDs, and digital verification logs. The pharmacist provided evidence of her professional assignments, including schedules and licensing confirmations. Each document corroborated her account and aligned with the records from her employer and state licensing board. In response to the findings, the officer faced termination. The department cited failure to follow verification protocols and repeated dismissal of factual evidence as grounds for disciplinary action. The supervisor who had confirmed the pharmacist's identity remained involved in procedural adjustments, ensuring the proper chain of command was clarified for future stops. Policy changes were introduced. Officers received updated guidance on handling professional credentials, verifying employment records, and reducing reliance on assumptions based on appearance or perceived role. The pharmacist filed a civil lawsuit against the department, arguing that the stop constituted wrongful questioning and professional humiliation. The legal process unfolded over several months, including discovery of internal communications, deposition of the officer, and review of departmental policies. Ultimately, the lawsuit concluded with a settlement of $2.5 million, reflecting both procedural failure and the impact of repeated misjudgment. No criminal wrongdoing was attributed to either party. The settlement focused on civil liability and organizational accountability. Media coverage was factual and restrained, reporting the outcome of the lawsuit and highlighting procedural lessons rather than dramatizing the stop. Local news outlets noted the settlement, summarizing the interaction and emphasizing the importance of proper verification protocols. Social media coverage remained limited, with some discussion of professional bias in routine traffic stops. The story did not escalate into sensationalized commentary, maintaining focus on factual events. The pharmacist returned to her regular work schedule, with minor adjustments to travel arrangements to prevent similar encounters. She maintained a professional demeanor throughout, and her colleagues noted her continued attention to compliance and documentation. While the incident had created temporary stress, it did not alter her professional reputation or daily routines. By the end of this section, the narrative demonstrates how a routine roadside stop extended into a formal investigation, legal action, and policy change. The consequences are clear, measured, and procedural, showing how misjudgment can ripple into professional and organizational outcomes without exaggeration or melodrama. The incident highlights the role of assumptions in routine professional encounters. In this case, the officer relied on mental models of what a pharmacist should look like and dismissed legitimate documentation that did not match those expectations. This pattern is subtle. It does not involve overt hostility, shouting, or force, but it can create unnecessary tension and procedural delay. The story shows that assumptions can quietly escalate an ordinary situation into one with significant consequences. Professional bias can affect anyone, even those with fully verified credentials. The pharmacist in this story followed every procedure, presented all required identification, and maintained compliance throughout the encounter. Yet the repeated questioning and disbelief demonstrate how systemic factors, patterns of assumptions embedded in training, protocols, or past experience, can influence decision-making. Misjudgment does not require intent or malice. It can emerge from cognitive shortcuts applied in routine work. The broader lesson is procedural. Organizations that rely on discretionary judgment must ensure that verification processes are followed consistently. Small lapses, such as disregarding official identification or failing to consult available verification systems promptly, can escalate incidents unnecessarily. In this case, intervention by a supervisor, along with formal verification of professional records, corrected the misunderstanding. The resolution depended entirely on process and evidence, not emotion or negotiation. Ordinary environments, roadsides, offices, workplaces, can become sites of disproportionate scrutiny when assumptions go unchecked. The story emphasizes that systemic awareness is essential for preventing similar outcomes. Departments and organizations benefit from clear policies, updated training, and accountability measures that reduce reliance on personal judgment when objective verification is available. This reflection is not about assigning blame to individuals, but about recognizing how subtle patterns of bias affect outcomes. Calm observation, factual verification, and procedural oversight are sufficient to resolve misunderstandings before they escalate. The pharmacist's experience demonstrates that compliance and professionalism alone may not prevent misjudgment if systemic processes are not fully applied. The incident also underlines the importance of formal accountability. Investigation, policy review, and eventual legal settlement ensured that the procedural failure was addressed. The outcome reinforces the idea that systems, rather than individuals alone, bear responsibility for preventing misjudgment. It shows how real-world consequences can emerge quietly, even from brief, contained interactions. By examining this event from a social and procedural perspective, viewers are encouraged to consider the influence of assumptions, the importance of verification, and the systemic mechanisms that protect professional integrity. The reflection remains factual, restrained, and focused on observable behaviors and outcomes rather than moralizing or emotional interpretation. What do you think about this incident? Have you ever experienced a situation where your credentials, work, or professional identity were questioned despite being legitimate? Share your experiences in the comments. Hearing how others navigate similar situations can help us understand patterns and challenges that exist in everyday interactions. If you found this story informative, consider following the channel for more real-world cases that focus on factual events, professional encounters, and systemic lessons. We explore these situations calmly and objectively, showing what really happens and how processes affect outcomes. Your perspective matters. Discuss, reflect, and connect with others who have seen or experienced professional misjudgment or procedural complications.